and welcome to Joy in Our Town. I'm your host, Vanessa Rose. Thank you so much for tuning in today to join us for another great edition. Today, we are so honored to be joined by the Honorable Bill Montgomery, who is our Maricopa County Attorney. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Vanessa.
Pleasure to have you. You've been here once long ago in the past and had wonderful things to share. Our viewing audience enjoyed everything you had to talk about. And so thank you for taking time to be here again.
Oh, no, I'm glad you brought me back. That tells me I did my job the first time.
Yes, yes. So whenever you get a re-invitation, right?
Exactly.
Well, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about yourself for people who aren't familiar with you and kind of what you do and maybe a little bit of your history and how you got here.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Southern California, and I won't go all the way back to that day in 1967, but I grew up in Southern California and did my undergrad at West Point. I served in the military for about 6.5 years, and then I worked in the high-tech sector in Silicon Valley before going to law school here at ASU. And I went to law school to be a prosecutor. I was privileged to be able to spend my last year at law school working as a prosecutor at the City of Phoenix, the County Attorney's Office, and then at the AG's office and U.S. Attorney's Office, every level of prosecution before I graduated, and went to work at the Maricopa County Attorney's Office right afterwards and spent about 5.5 years there as a line prosecutor. And sandwiched in between that was some time spent in the civil sector working for an insurance defense firm before coming back. And then I was first elected Maricopa County Attorney at a special election in 2010. The prior county attorney resigned to run for Attorney General, so we had a special election to fill out the rest of that term. I was reelected in 2012 and finishing up my first full 4-year term.
Wonderful. Well, I know that you do a lot of great things here in the state, and
thank you.
I'm sure that everyone has their own opinions on things. But from the point of the law, I know that you've done a lot to help the law prevail and to help justice prevail. So thank you for doing what you do and for being a civil servant to the people of Maricopa County. And
Thanks.
we are a very, very large county, so you govern over and rule over a lot of people.
Oh yeah, we're now the 4th largest county in the nation by population.
Wow.
We have about 4.1 million. And the office itself is the 3rd largest county-based prosecution agency in the country now.
Wow.
Only Cook County, which encompasses Chicago, and LA County are larger.
My goodness. So that's a lot of people and a lot of justice to be had.
Yes.
In an area. So thank you so much for taking the time away from that busy schedule to be here with us today. And for all of you at home, today we're speaking about civic affairs, and our first topic is prison population. We hear a lot about crime rates, about prison, about people being incarcerated. Concerns have been raised at the national level about the costs to incarcerate people. Who do we have in prisons here in Arizona, and what is the cost associated with incarcerating people?
Sure, and that's the right question to start with. If you start with a question or asking whether we have too many people in prison, you're not going to be able to then have a follow-on conversation to try to address concerns about recidivism or what can we do to more effectively use our criminal justice dollars. So asking that question, who is in prison, is a great starting point. And in Arizona, in the last 4 or 5 years, gosh, maybe going back now 6 years, about every 2 years we've had a study published, and by we, I'm referring to the Arizona Prosecuting Attorneys Advisory Council, that looks exactly at who is in Arizona's prisons. Beginning in 2009, then again in 2011 and 2013, we've seen a steady uptick in the percentage of inmates who are there for a violent offense or repetitive felonies. And the most recent report that was published August 13th of 2013, we saw 95.1% of inmates were there for a violent offense or repetitive felonies. In other words, those committing the greatest harm or responsible for the most crime in our community. On average, it costs about $25,000 a year to incarcerate someone in our prison. But if you look at the number of felonies a repetitive felon is likely to commit over the course of a year, which is about 12, if one of those felonies cost us $5,000, and that's on the extreme low end, impact to victims, insurance companies, lost productivity, time spent being in court, so $5,000 on the low end, we would stop 12 of those felonies a year with incarceration. That's $60,000 a year. So we spend $25,000, we save $60,000. We're actually saving our community $35,000 a year incarcerating an inmate like that.
Wow, and so that's something, because you hear about the high cost of incarceration and how much it costs to keep someone in prison. But if you're looking at the repetitive offenses that statistics show are happening, you're actually saving taxpayers money by keeping them incarcerated.
Right, and that's sort of the other side of the ledger, because often we talk about the cost, and it's fine to talk about the cost. We want government to be financially accountable. But you also have to look at the other side of that ledger when it comes to criminal justice, because government has a constitutional duty to provide for public safety so that we can enjoy the liberties that our Constitution protects. And so in looking at that then, are we getting our money's worth? And I would argue from the data I just shared that if we're preventing on average 12 victims a year, if we're saving on average then, considering the cost, $35,000 a year because of new offenses that aren't committed, the criminal justice system and our prison system is doing its job in that regard.
And so this kind of falls into then public safety. So how are prosecutors using that to promote public safety?
Okay, another good question, because there are some folks who would argue that prosecutors use incarceration as the default tool, sort of even willing to use it in cases where it may not be justified, trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer. But that's not true. Prosecutors look at the nature of the offense that was committed and the degree of harm to the victim, and at an individual's criminal history to determine whether or not incarceration is called for. For first-time offenders within Maricopa County, oftentimes they're even going to get a shot at diversion where they can avoid prosecution by completing certain programs designed to address substance abuse issues or to help with behavior that results in recidivism, more crimes being committed. And we're focusing on that because if this is someone's first crime, we want to see if they really did make a mistake and if they can avoid doing it again. And even if we didn't do that and we charge someone with a first-time felony, unless that person has committed a dangerous crime using a deadly weapon or a dangerous instrument, a gun, knife, what have you, or they've caused serious physical injury to an individual, or it's a certain crime against a child or a certain sexually related offense, except for those categories, or transporting or selling drugs above a statutory threshold. Those are the only offenses in which you go to prison the first time, no matter what your prior criminal record is. Otherwise, just about every other felony in the criminal law in Arizona, you're going to get probation.
Okay.
So the overwhelming majority of first-time felons
That's for
get
first-time
probation.
offenders.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. First-time offenders. If you come back into the criminal justice system a second time, you're still likely going to receive a plea offer to resolve the case short of trial, where you may have a chance to argue for probation. It's really only the third time you come through, again, not having committed one of those other types of offenses, that we start looking at incarceration as the necessary tool to keep you from committing more crimes or to safeguard the public from a violent offender. So someone will get 3 chances, and I'm not talking about a 3 strikes law either. We don't have the kind of 3 strikes law in Arizona most people think about. But it's only then do we start looking at incarceration as a primary tool to try to modify or affect someone's behavior. So when you look at that prison population, the important thing to keep in mind too is, as I told you, over 95% are there for a violent offense or repetitive felonies. They didn't commit just 1 felony, not just 2. We're talking 3 or more. And in the 2011 study, I think it has a breakdown in that one. And all these studies are available at azsentencing.org. In that study, it indicated that most inmates in prison are there with 3 or more prior felonies. So these are people, they've had opportunities. But you might say then, okay, that 4.9% that doesn't fall into that violent repetitive offender category, who are they? Well, we may call them nonviolent offenders, but their crimes are serious for us in Arizona. And the majority of them, over 60%, are there for drug trafficking or drug sales. Now, for us in Arizona, where we have a relatively unsecure border, and roughly half of all drug smuggling in the United States comes across our border, that's part of the violent and or criminal environment we have to deal with in law enforcement. So, of course, we're going to have a lot of people incarcerated for those offenses because we have to do what we can to try to deter that conduct. Otherwise, our community suffers.
That's very interesting to hear, though, because you hear there's, of course, on the political spectrum, and there's people that argue that, we're putting minor offenders that are their first time with marijuana or with something so minimal, and we're filling up our jail systems. That's not the case. That's not the way that the system works. If it's a first or a second and a minimal offense underneath the statutory limit, you're not just throwing people in prison, because sometimes you hear these lavish arguments that we're just throwing people in prison for using something for one time or for doing something one time, and that's not really the way that it's happening here.
No, the truth is very different. If you go to that August 31st, 2013 report, as a matter of fact, and you look up the number of people who are in prison for possession of marijuana, it's 131. Now, for any one of those 131 individuals to have gotten to prison, a couple of things had to have happened. Either A, they had committed a violent offense in the past and were not eligible for mandatory substance abuse treatment, and therefore we took advantage of that felony to try to safeguard the community because we wanted to put a violent offender away for as long as we could. Or that was a charge that was pled down from drug trafficking or drug sales, and we allowed them instead to plead guilty to possession to get a lesser sentence. Or, and this is the only other way you can go to prison for possession of marijuana, it was a third offense or more. Okay. Arizona voters back in 1996 passed what was then called Proposition 200, a measure which mandates substance abuse treatment for your first and second possession or use offenses. The first time you're charged with a possession of marijuana offense, you can't even get jail time as punishment. You cannot be sentenced to prison. The second time, you cannot be sentenced to prison. And while you could be sentenced to jail, it never happens, so we don't ask for it. So it's only that third time. And with our felony intervention program now, we're really looking at trying to maximize the success we've had on diverting substance abuse offenders. We have a successful program where over 75% of those who complete it never go on to commit another crime.
Wow.
And that is, in addition to the mandatory treatment, we're also trying to incentivize people to be successful. We get as prosecutors that addiction can be a terrible thing, but we want to give people a chance to get better, and we want them to have a chance to be successful. The other important thing to realize, too, out of that is that it was prosecutors who went to the legislature a few years back and asked them to change the law that authorizes us now to offer a diversion program, even if somebody has a prior felony conviction. And we did it for this reason. I told you about the two mandatory substance abuse opportunities, but if someone had already been convicted of a possession offense and they were coming back and they had to get substance abuse treatment, we couldn't give them a diversion program because they'd already been convicted once. So we weren't able to provide what might have been that last incentive to help people comply and to heal and become better. And it was prosecutors who asked for that opportunity to do it. So we don't look for incarceration first, unless it's someone who's really hurt another human being or harmed a child severely, and that's what we need to do to protect the community.
No, it sounds like a fair system and like a system that's trying to help people and give them that opportunity to, you get caught once, straighten up, get your act together, you get caught again, you get another chance, straighten up, get your act together, and if you keep going, then that's whenever you have the statistics of 12 offenses in a year, and that's whenever they become harmful to society, and you don't want them to be out in society hurting people. And so it sounds like a very fair system, and it's wonderful to hear from you. We just have about a minute left in this segment, but just wanted to ask you briefly about what the current crime rate is here in Arizona.
Okay, so that's how we use incarceration in those diversion programs.
Yes.
Today we have a 50-year low in our crime rate. We have a 50-year low in the homicide rate. We have a 40-year low in the violent crime rate. We have about a 45-year low in the robbery rate. We haven't had auto theft this low going all the way back to 1960.
Wow.
So we're safer in Maricopa County in Arizona today, and we've been using incarceration where called for and using diversion programs where provided for, and we're getting significant results.
That is wonderful. There's so many more questions I wanted to ask you, but it's just so much wonderful information to share. But thank you again for being here to share this. You can always go to the website, maricopacountyattorney.org, if you'd like to know more about the office and what they do at the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Please don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short message.
I'm gonna count. 300, 5,000, 100, 14, 15, 16, 8,000,
3,000, 3,012,
53, 54,
Just in Arizona alone?
Wow. That's a lot.
Welcome back to Joy in Our Town. I'm your host, Vanessa Rose. Thank you so much for staying with us. If you just happen to be joining us, today we are joined by the Honorable Bill Montgomery. He is our Maricopa County Attorney. Thank you so much for staying with us.
Absolutely, Vanessa.
It's a pleasure to have you here and to share with us what's happening in our county, in our city, in our state that's really applies to each and every one of us, because even if someone has never been in the criminal justice system, has never been in court, it still affects them because we're living in a community where people are affected by that every day. And so for you watching at home, we are speaking about civic affairs, and our second topic is criminal justice and substance abuse and mental health. This is something we hear a lot about substance abuse, about mental health now in the headlines nationally, locally, statewide. It's something we're hearing a lot more about. How does substance abuse affect crime?
Right. Well, there are sort of two sides to that coin. On the one side are those individuals who, for whatever reason, have developed an addiction to a substance, whether it's alcohol or a particular drug, and criminal behavior is then a consequence of it, whether it's to commit crimes to feed that habit, or in the instance of impaired driving, it's a crime that occurs because they've engaged in abusing that substance to begin with. On the other side of the coin, there are those individuals who engage in using unlawful substances or illegal drugs because it's illegal, and they like to engage in criminal conduct in general. There's a work by an individual named Dr. Stanton Samenow that I'm familiar with, in which an individual is interviewed about their drug use. And their response is, if you legalize drugs, I'll go find something else that's illegal to do. So one of the struggles we have as prosecutors is trying to distinguish which side of that coin is somebody on. If they're on the side of the coin where addiction is the root cause of criminal conduct, then that's what we want to try to address. Because if we can do that, then we're not going to see that person in the criminal justice system again. And that's a win-win-win for everyone. It's good for that person and their family. It's good for the criminal justice system because we don't have to use resources on that person anymore. And then the community has got somebody who can then be productive and contribute. On the other hand, if it's an individual that we can identify is just engaged in wide-scale criminal activity, well, then the substance abuse that they're engaged in is just one other behavior among others. And we're either going to address their propensity for criminal conduct overall, or we're going to have to use incarceration in order to safeguard the community from the consequences of that type of behavior. And then there are times, too, where substance abuse, and this kind of then bleeds over into mental health, where substance abuse is a co-occurring incident, where some individuals who are suffering from a mental health illness will abuse drugs trying to treat their own symptoms. And you know, there's the phrase that the person who has, who is a client for themselves, is their own lawyer, as a fool for a client. I'll spit it out eventually. I know better never to do that. You know, in many ways, and the person who tries to be their own doctor is just worsening their situation. Yes. And so we also try to identify those circumstances so that for most people then, when they're a first-time offender, we can try to get them the treatment and services they need in order to address the underlying condition. And that's, whenever you speak about substance abuse, you're also speaking about our DUI laws here in Arizona then as well, anything with alcohol related or anything. Correct. And because we are known as one of the toughest states, one of the toughest counties on drinking and driving. That's right. The tragedy of abusing alcohol and then driving is that the people who most often wind up getting hurt are completely innocent and they're not impaired. Mm-hmm. And whenever someone takes to the street having drank too much alcohol, and our standard in the state is being impaired to the slightest degree, they're not just taking their own life at risk, but they're also putting the lives of others at risk. And so we approach the issue both of addressing that particular criminal conduct, but in prevention too, and wanting to avoid a more horrific circumstance. That was one of the areas of crimes that I prosecuted first when I worked as a prosecutor in the county attorney's office. So I've seen the instances in which other people have been hurt or killed because of someone's selfish decision, that rather than call for a designated driver or admit they've had too much to drink and ask for help, they decide to drive, and they put everybody at risk
it's
doing it.
It's something that's so avoidable, too. It's something that's so easily avoidable by just one wise decision, and so...
Oh, exactly. And there's an irony in this, too. If I'm at a bar and I've had too much to drink, and now I'm physically impaired, I can't drive, then everyone would expect me to call for help. But if I'm not in that particular circumstance, maybe if I'm addicted to prescription medication, I've had surgery and I had painkillers, oxycodone, Oxycontin, for example, but I become addicted to it, there's a certain stigma associated with it. And people are less likely to want to reach out for help. Instead, they try to deal with their addiction on their own. And what that winds up looking like, though, is perpetuating taking that medication and making it worse. Similarly, too, for mental illness. There's a stigma associated with it that keeps people from trying to get help at the earliest possible moment, before things get worse, before something happens, before their own health or that of others is at risk. You know, if I went for a run this afternoon and I pulled a hamstring, and the next day I walked into work and I walked with a limp, and I couldn't use the stairs, or I was really slow getting out of a car and I had to try to find a parking spot really close to a building, everybody would understand. It's, oh, you hurt yourself, so you have to do these things in order to try to compensate and get better. But yet if I were to say I had a tragic family or personal event and I'm having a hard time coping, there are too many people who would look at that as, well, that's weakness. That's your failure to be able to handle things as a human being. Instead of looking at it and saying, then you know what, you need help. It's okay to go get professional help or to call, or I need to be more empathetic and I need to provide you space to get better in that regard, just as I would if you hurt yourself physically. We need to get geared more in that direction so we can start to address the more systemic issues that we have with mental health in our community.
No, absolutely. I've known people personally in my own life that have dealt with mental health issues, and it's unfortunate because there is such a stigma there that people treat it as a disease or how some person is not capable or functioning, and there are many people that are functioning in our community that do deal with issues of depression or coping or issues, and if they just felt that maybe there was a little more of a welcoming hand to them, then they probably would be more willing to find that help.
Absolutely.
Do prosecutors take substance abuse into account when charging in a case?
In some instances we do. In general, voluntary intoxication is not a defense or a justification to any criminal offense. So you can't have a circumstance, and think of the DUI laws up front, where if I crashed into somebody and hurt them, I can't say, well, I'm an alcoholic, and therefore that's why I did what I did. Okay. It's not going to be acceptable. There are instances, though, in which if someone was so intoxicated that they could not form the requisite mental state to commit a crime, and many people may have heard that as mens rea, if they could not have intentionally done something, it could be a significant factor in determining whether or not we could charge the case. So it might be considered in that regard. There are other instances too, though, with substance abuse where, let's say someone is addicted to heroin, which we're seeing all too frequently now. And as a consequence of that, somebody takes advantage of them to have them commit an offense. I'll give you a scenario where an individual goes out and recruits people who are addicted to heroin to go steal items from a store in order to sell it to them at a discount so that person can then go resell the stolen products. We want to take into account the substance abuse and the addiction to heroin that the other individuals are suffering from and hold the person who took advantage of them more accountable for that. Because if we can help them overcome their heroin addiction, then we're addressing the root cause for their criminal conduct. We're not going to see them again. Plus, we'll have a human being then who's been made healthy and restored. And they'll fight for their sobriety the rest of their life, but we'll have someone then who can be more productive. And I'd rather do that than to have someone spend time in a jail cell or a prison cell where if we could just address the addiction, we're not going to have any other issues. Once we get to violent crimes, though, and other things along that line of that serious in nature, there really isn't any room to take into account substance abuse because now we're more focused on helping the victims of crime and safeguarding the community.
Is it the same approach with mental illness, or is that a little bit different? Because I know that's one thing you hear of, you know, claiming temporary insanity. We only have a couple minutes here, but is that something that's used as a scapegoat almost by prosecutors at times?
Well, Not so much a scapegoat. There are circumstances where we have to take that into account as a matter of law. Because if you're not competent to stand trial, you can't participate in your defense, you have no idea what the process is, then the whole purpose of the criminal justice system can't be met. We can't get someone to understand why they're there or why they're going to be punished. So there's no opportunity for rehabilitation. There's no opportunity for someone to then learn that they're hurting others and not to do it. Where we have a hard time, though, is when someone tries to fake mental illness and tries to use that as an excuse for their conduct or to avoid punishment. And mental illness, again, is difficult because you can't see it. So just as it's difficult for me to be empathetic or to be understanding of someone who may be suffering from mental illness because I can't see it, it's also difficult for me as a prosecutor to understand if you have a particular condition that I really need to take into account because I can't see it. There are occasions where we do have objective medical evidence that establishes that someone does have a mental illness, and then yes, we will take that into account. Because again, if we can treat someone's underlying condition, and but for their mental illness we would never see them in the criminal justice system, then it's not just to incarcerate them. It's better to help them get healthy.
Absolutely, and then you have a lower recidivism rate, and you have more active members in society and productive members in society, and it's something that I think people are so afraid of the criminal justice system, but they don't understand it's really there to help, because you don't want to keep them there. You want to get them out. So you want to move them out and move them up in life. But thank you so much for everything you're doing here in our county and our state, and thank you for taking the time to be here. It always goes way too fast whenever you're here. You have so many great things to say. But thank you so much at home for watching Joy in Our Town. We always enjoy being with you every week in your home, and we look forward to seeing you right here next week. Go and have a great day.
This program has been sponsored by the Trinity Broadcasting Network and is made possible by your telethon dollars. Your continual support can keep Joy in Our Town coming to your home every week. Write to Joy in Our Town, Post Office Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711.